Okay, grade sevens. The Spanish Flu, part one. We have pretty much finished up World War One with the Treaty of Versailles. That was your last class on World War One. That gave you a really basic overview of World War One. You will dig much deeper into that in your future classes, but I always like to introduce it in grade 7 because when you start looking at it in grade 9 in Mr. Lake's class and I'm sure grade 10, 11, 12, you'll just have that much greater of an understanding of what it all was. Around the same time, 1918, the Spanish flu rocked the world, much in the same way that this global pandemic COVID-19 is currently rocking our world. But in fact, the Spanish flu was a lot worse, and we're going to learn about that today because I think it's fascinating. I apologize if it's a little freaky, but it's fascinating, and it shouldn't. This isn't any information to scare you, it's more to inform. Because when we have been through something similar in history, then we can only learn from what we've done in the past. That's why I love history so much. So, I'll just read through this and kind of add some anecdotes and some thoughts, and I'm sure you guys will all have your own ideas and thoughts too, so we can chat about it. But this is just the first part. We're going to do this in 2 parts, and that's that. So, why look at the Spanish flu in history? Like many events throughout our history, looking into the past can help us prepare for the future. We are currently going through a global pandemic that almost seems unthinkable. However, if we look just 100 years ago in our past, we can find a similar moment in time when an illness froze the world. There are many things we have learned from this time, and many reasons to do our research and understand how we reacted, compared to what is happening now. Okay, so you can already see there in the picture, it says Spanish influenza. The sign says has endangered the prosecution of the war in Europe. It says these something cases in the Navy Yard, 30 deaths have already resulted. Spitting spreads Spanish influenza. Don't spit. Right? Interesting sign because we've already. It seems like a very obvious sign. You'll kind of find that some of this information is very obvious. Like, of course, we shouldn't be spitting at anybody, but. I get that. They know at this point that we do not want to, don't want to get any spit anywhere, really, touching other people, because it's a very similar way that this was contracted. When and how did this begin? It's unknown exactly where the particular strain of influenza that caused the pandemic came from. However, the 1918 flu was first observed in Europe, America, and areas of Asia before spreading to almost every part of the planet within a matter of months. So despite the fact that the 1918 flu wasn't isolated to one place, it became known around the world as the Spanish flu, as Spain was hit hard by the disease and was not subject to the wartime news blackouts that affected other European countries. So interestingly enough, we actually shouldn't be calling it the Spanish flu. If we're calling this the Spanish flu, then we would be calling COVID-19 the Chinese flu, which is extremely derogatory and in many ways can instill a sense of racism. So it's really not a good idea to do that. However, this was the name that was given to this flu because it was a different social era, right? People weren't thinking as much about that. They just kind of thought, well, this has really hit Spain hard, so we're going to call it the Spanish flu. And nowadays, we don't do that with words. When people started kind of toying with the idea of maybe calling this the Chinese flu, people got really frustrated right away and got on that and said, no. We're not calling this the Wuhan flu or the Chinese flu. We're calling this what it is, COVID-19. So It says, I have little notes throughout this little presentation that are in blue and red there that say we learned from this. This is just sort of my own little anecdotes, my own little evidence I think that we have learned from many of the events that went on during the time of the 1918 flu. So it says, and this is exactly what I just said, naming a global illness after a country is not considered very fair and can instill racism and fear surrounding that country. We heard rumblings of COVID-19 being called the Chinese flu, but people quickly understood that not only is it wrong, but it also could jeopardize the safety of the Asian population worldwide. So who did it affect most? One unusual aspect of the 1918 flu was that it struck down many previously healthy young people, a group normally resistant to this type of infectious illness, including a number of World War I servicemen. So this is interesting because for sure it's different than the flu that's going around now. We know that COVID-19 can affect people who are not vulnerable, but it's pretty rare to affect people who are not old or who are not already suffering from another illness. So in fact, more U.S. soldiers died from the 1918 flu that were killed in battle during the war. That's a wild statistics. Like way more soldiers died from the flu than in the actual war that we just studied. So 40% of the U.S. Navy was hit with the flu, while 36% of the Army became ill, and troops moving around the world in crowded ships and trains helped to spread the killer virus. Of course, I didn't put on there that we learned from this, but we did learn from this because immediately we stopped traveling in trains and ships and planes. We tried to stop that as quickly as possible. I'm sure that as you look up in the air recently, you are not seeing planes. I actually saw a plane for the first time yesterday, and I was surprised, to be honest, because we're not seeing a lot of them. It may have been the only real, there are lots of planes still flying, but not many passengers are flying in them. So let's crunch the numbers, or at least try to. Although the death toll attributed to the Spanish flu is often estimated at 20 million to 50 million victims worldwide, other estimates run as high as 100 million victims, around 3% of the world's population. The exact numbers are impossible to know due to the lack of medical record keeping in many places. So we also learned from this. Due to an increase in medical efficiency and record keeping, you have likely noticed that the media is constantly posting test numbers and caseloads. That's what we keep on talking about with COVID-19, is getting tests, increasing the amount of tests. We are tracking COVID-19 very closely so that people can be isolated if they are ill. This keeps overall numbers low. South Korea particularly has been extremely efficient in testing to keep numbers low. So how to stay safe? Something as deadly as the 1918 flu had not yet happened in the world, and people struggled to figure out ways to stay safe. Social distancing did occur, but it took time for people to truly understand what that meant. So check out some interesting primary sources to your right. Above is the public service announcement from a Halifax newspaper. Below is a PSA from the USA Health Service. Does it sound a little bit familiar is what I ask. So I want you to read those and think about that. So, of course, we also learned from this. Have a closer look at the PSAs to the right. A lot of the information is very familiar. One says walk to work. We have understood that nobody should be going to work. Covering a cough with a handkerchief, although smart, also could prevent the illness further. So instead, masks are now widely recommended. However, we did learn from this, but also we have difficulties with things like masks, right? Many of us go out with masks, but some of us still have a bit of a stigma. There's a stigma against masks in our culture, which is interesting. So social distancing and flattening the curve. Surely you have all heard the term social distancing by now. We are all doing this because this has happened before. In response to the Spanish flu being as deadly as it was, people across the country were told to practice socially distancing. We have proof that this method worked in decreasing the amount of people who fell ill. I just find this fascinating. Look at that picture right there. That's from a newspaper in 1918. So interesting that we've seen this diagram before. We know that these strategies worked well in 1918 due to the fact that not all cities practiced social distancing as well as they could have. So check out that chart on St. Louis and Philadelphia, and you can see. I want you to figure out which city there probably had more deaths. Next we'll take a deeper look at how people fought the Spanish flu and the toll that it had on its society and the economy of people. Okay, you have no homework today. I just want you to be interested in this. Maybe you can go research this on your own, and we'll do an assignment at the end of next class so that this is when you'll have all of the material that you need to complete some work. Okay, thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.